Welcome back to the Foundation in C# course. We are currently in Module 7, and in this lesson, we're going to be covering WPF, or Windows Presentation Foundation. So let's dive right into what this is. Let's go to our Visual Studio, go to New Project, and we're going to select a WPF application, and we're going to select the .NET Core version. Now for this demo, I'm also going to add in a .NET Framework version just so you can see the differences, but we're going to build in the .NET Core application. Let's hit Next. And let's call this the WPF Message Wall and Message Wall app. Now you're going to see a lot of very similar demos over and over again as we look at the different user interface project types. And that's intentional, because I want to show you a direct comparison between the different types. So we're going to show off similar things in a similar manner. I'm going to try and keep that the same. The same thing is true with our homework for our mini projects. We're going to do the same application over and over again. And while you may think, man, that's boring, I want to do something different, what that allows you to do is see a direct comparison between the two and see the differences, and that kind of highlights those differences. If we do different project types, first of all, it's hard to come up with multiple different demo projects that are simple and yet show off something, but also it won't necessarily give you a good comparison between the user interfaces. You might get a bad experience with one user interface just because we do a different project type than another. So this way you get the same thing over and over again, and you get to see the differences highlighted for each different user interface. So it won't be exactly the same, but we're going to do some similar things. Okay, once this gets created, then we're going to add in our .NET Framework project as well. All right, and it's just about done. There we go. Once it's completely restored the NuGet packages, then we can see our window. So if you saw it blinked up really quick there, but it was loading NuGet packages before it could even display our form. So this is a brand new WPF project. Before I explain it though, let's go ahead and add that other project just so we have a comparison. So WPF app.NET Framework. You normally wouldn't do this. Normally you'd have just your one project type. Let's call this the WPF Framework Demo UI. And hit Create. And once this loads, we'll be able to see the differences. So let's come on over here and we're going to look at the solution and look at the different projects. So let's zoom in here on the different project types. And this is our framework project, and this one right here, the one we'll actually use, is our .NET Core project. So the differences, we have properties and references here versus just dependencies over here. Okay, that's just like we had with the .NET Framework versus .NET Core class library. Besides that, we have an app.config file here where we don't have anything equivalent down in our .NET Core project. Then we have app.xaml window or main window.xaml, which XAML is XAML. That's how you pronounce XAML. And then the .cs file. That's the same as these three right here. So the structure is fairly similar, but we do have that collapse right here of these two project or properties and references into just dependencies, and the properties are on the project itself. And we're missing app.config. In .NET Framework projects, app.config for desktop applications or web.config for web applications is an XML storage place for all of our settings. We don't have that concept in .NET Core, at least not the same way. Instead, if we want to add settings, we can add an appsettings.json file, or we can use a secrets.json file, or we can use everything up through Key Vault in Azure. So there's multiple different settings places we could store things. And it all depends on us and how we set things up. Whereas with WPF projects, they said, yep, that right there, that's the solution for storing data. And we'll get to use the app.config and the appsettings.json more when we talk about databases in the next course. But for now, we probably won't touch it that much. That's just for settings that you want to be able to change while your application is running. So we'll add those later when we have a database to access. But for right now, we probably won't touch it. So those are the big differences between the WPF project for Framework and the WPF project for .NET Core. We'll stick with the .NET Core version, and let's talk through what this is. So we have here main window.xaml, XAML. WPF applications are desktop applications. In fact, if we just hit run right now, and the core project is the startup project, so that's what's going to run. Once that runs, it's going to take a minute the first time to compile. We get this window right here where it says main window. We have our minimize, maximize, and close buttons. And we can shrink and grow this how we want to move it around. And of course, the close button does actually work. So it's very, very similar to what we saw in WinForms. The difference is the designer. Now, the designer is this window right here. And we have our toolbox. So let's go to our toolbox. And if we wanted to, we could even drag and drop buttons onto the screen and drag and drop labels onto the screen and text boxes. And all of a sudden, we have something very, very similar to what we had in our Windows forms. Now, the designer itself has some funky layout stuff, but the end result looks a lot like WinForms. So what is the difference? Oops. Well, that's hard to work with. It's hard to grab the actual window itself. So what's the difference besides this editor being a little funkier to work with? Well, the answer is this down here, this bottom part, which is this text. Notice we have button, label, and text box. This isn't something we see in Windows Forms. This is particular to WPF, and it replaces the idea of the partial class. Notice we come back to this class right here. It's still a partial class. We still have initialized components. And if we go there, this is the other part of our class. It has different inheritance, but in here, there's nothing about our text box, there's nothing about our label, and there's nothing about our button. All that work is done right here in this XAML window, XAML. So this is Microsoft's next iteration of desktop applications. WinForms is all about drag and drop, and the idea was they put all those properties into a class file that we just didn't touch, or at least shouldn't touch. And that's how they kept track of what to put on the screen where. With WPF, they say, you know what, let's create a better experience for how we lay out these controls. And so they decided, you know what, everyone likes XML, and I'm saying that with much sarcasm. But so let's create our designer out of XML, but let's make it an application markup language, so XAML. Okay, that's what the A is for, is application. All right, so this is that XAML. Okay, so it looks very similar to what you might see on a web page, where you have an open tag and then you have a close tag. Notice the close, you can identify it because it's got a slash, before the name. So grid and slash grid indicates open and close. And then you have these elements you can put on the page. And these right here define, let's give us some more real estate here. These define the values for, let's say, this button. So this button has a vertical alignment of top. It has a width of 75, and it has a margin set of 133, 147.00. And if we look at the designer, it actually shows us 147 is down from the top, 133 is from the left. So left, top, right, bottom. So if I were to say, you know what, I want to move it down just a little bit more. Let's do 160. And now it's down a little further. And let's do it a little bit less from the left. Let's make it more like 120. And say, well, but that label up there needs to be aligned to the left as well. Let's line that at 120. And the same thing for text box. And now we know that they're pixel perfect aligned on the left here, because they're all exactly in line. So you can do stuff like that, and it would seem like, that's a nice addition to just dragging things around and saying, well, yep, that looks good, and we're good to go. But here's the deal. You want to transition away from the thought process that comes with Windows Forms. Windows Forms is all about drag and drop onto the screen. That's how you design things. That's how you build things. In WPF, you don't do it that way. So this drag and drop here, not a great experience for WPF. It's not what it was designed to do. In fact, this is pretty much a hack, something you should not do. Now, why is that? Well, if we run this application, wait for it. All right, so we're running the application. Actually, nothing's visible. That's awesome. Am I even on the right window? Let's find out. Let's go to my Solution Explorer. I'm in the wrong window. I'm in my WPF, the other WPF window. No problem. I'm going to cut that out from there, and I'm going to go over to this WPF app and paste it in, because WPF is WPF. All right, let's save all that and then close everything else down. So it's on the wrong window. It's on the framework version, not the WPF core version. So there we go. So there's my label, my text box, which we can type in, the button we can click, which does nothing right now. But if I expand this form, notice I just get more white space, just like WinForms. If I were to shrink this form too much, it covers up my fields, just like WinForms. Well, WPF was designed better than this. WPF was designed to be flexible, more like a web page, but only if you want it to. Now, a quick spoiler alert, yes, you want it to. So you could do this drag and drop, but I highly encourage you not to, because this introduces technical debt. And what technical debt is it's stuff that right now works, but later you're going to have to pay the bill for it. So if you ever want to come back and redesign something or tweak something, you're going to have a lot more work to do because you did it poorly the first time. So let's talk through a very simple way to eliminate or make this better. Let's start with our text box. Right now we have a fixed height. Why do we have a fixed height? Get rid of it. We have margins that set up where it has to be. Let's eliminate this margin and see what happens. Well, it moves to the top. Not ideal, so let's keep that. Text wrapping, it wraps. It's a text box. Vertical line is top, and width. Why do we have a width? Let's get rid of it. Okay, so now this text box is positioned, it's fixed in position, but it doesn't have a set height or width. So why does it have a height at all? Well, it has a height because it has text in it. In fact, if we got rid of it, it would have a width of practically nothing, but a height of the average character or text. So let's just write like this, which is ugly, but let's make it work. Let's put it on a screen and see what happens with this little box. Let's put our cursor there, which is barely big enough to put a cursor in. I'm going to start typing. This is a test of the text box. Notice how the text box got bigger because I typed in it? That's one of the powers of WPF. The idea that it can expand to fill the need. So it says, I'm going to get as big as I need to. That's a really powerful tool you can use to make sure that you don't have this thing where your text is going beyond the screen and you can't see it. So with that, we can just keep typing. We can make this as big as you want, including getting to the edge of the form. And notice it goes on to the next line now. So if I just hit the key and just let it wrap, it just keeps going. But notice it just went over the button. Now I can't see the button. And that's kind of a bummer. What do I do about that? Well, that's where the idea that these layouts, where we're saying this is where it starts, that's not a great idea. Instead, we want to allow for some dynamic positioning. So let's start over on this form. The cool thing is, instead of having to select these things like this, I can just come down here and delete them. So this XAML window down here is the same as the designer. In fact, let me add to that. I'm going to undo my delete. If I'm on this button right here, if I go to Properties, I have a Properties window as well. And that Properties window applies to whatever I've selected, so the button. So I can add things like, I could change the text. Let's change the font size to 36. Notice how big that got. Okay, and notice down here, if I look at this button, let's put a line break in here so you can see the settings. Font size is 36. So these three are all related. If I move where this is positioned, let's look at the margin 120, 128. Now it says 120, 229 because I changed something up here. And that affected this down here, which also affects the properties. So these three things, the design window, the XAML, and the properties are all tied together. And you can modify things in any of the three, whichever one makes sense for what you're doing. All right, now let's close the property window out and let's delete these three things right here. Now this design versus XAML window can get a bit tedious at times because of the fact that it's not designed by default to pop this out into a separate tab of its own. I prefer to put this XAML on one window and my design on another. It's possible, but it doesn't mean that it is easy to do. But do note that you can use this button over here. Let's zoom in. These buttons right here. This one will shrink this window and show you just the designer. I don't think I use that hardly at all. But then this button says horizontal, meaning we're going to have the designer up top in a longer window. We're going to have the XAML in a longer window at the bottom. That's typically the better design surface just because we need a lot of space horizontally for our XAML. We can also do the vertical split, which puts the design window, the design window on the left and the XAML on the right. And you can play around with what works for you and for your situation. And it might even change over time. So right now, it may be better to do this and have this more visible over here. Or you can say, you know what, I want to flip these around, swap panes. Or I'll go back to horizontal like so. So there's a lot of different options you can do here, but just note that that's a possibility. Also, right now I'm zoomed in at 107.7%. You can select 100%, and that's exactly the size of your form. So for right now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this window bigger, the XAML window bigger. And let's look at what XAML is. So it starts off with a window, and this declares the information about this particular window. Things to note here, these are like using statements where we can shortcut it. So I can say D dot and then have everything that relates to blend. We'll use these probably in the future at some point. Right now, you probably won't use them very often. The class name is WPF message wall.main window. The class name is the code behind. That's this right here, the code behind for our WPF application. We also have down here the title. If we look up here, we see main window. It's kind of small, but main window. That's the title of our form. We could change this to message wall by Tim Corey, like so. And now it's reflected up here. The height and the width are the width and height of the form itself. So we can change this if we decide, you know what, I actually want a form that is just 20 high. And there you go. That's a 20 high form. And that's ridiculous. But you can say, you know what, I want my default width to be more like 1,000 because typically screens are 1920 by 1080. Therefore, the width could be up to 1900 or so pixels. So saying 1,000 is not a stretch, maybe even 1,400 or so. The height, same thing. We could say, you know what, I want that to be more like, 800 for the height and give yourself more real estate to work with. Or you can say, you know what, I'm going to leave it like this and let the user decide. Because these forms can grow and expand, grow and shrink based upon what the user requires. That's just the starting height and width. Now inside the window, it can have one item, and that's it, one item. But the item we have is called grid. Now a grid can have multiple items inside of it. So different controls can have items inside them, and some can't. This is another thing that's powerful about WPF, is the idea that we can stack things or nest things inside of other controls and build our own kind of super controls. In this case, we have a grid. Now, what do you think of when you think of grid? Well, you think of rows and columns. But we don't have any rows and columns yet. Let's specify some rows and columns. So I can say grid dot row definitions. And this is where I define my rows. I'm going to create, let's just say, let's do 4 rows. So row definition, inside of the row definitions, we have individual definitions. And a row really has one piece of information, and that's the height. That's the only thing you really need to define on a row. Well, I don't know what the height should be. And that's where WPF really shines. I can say auto. And auto says use whatever height you need. No more, but whatever height you need, you take it. And I can close this tag and have a self-closing tag. Normally you have an open tag and a close tag. You can tell a close tag by a slash. But if you don't have anything to put inside of those tags, you can have a self-closing tag by having a slash at the end. So let's copy this. That's row 0, row 1, row 2, row 3. But that third row, I'm saying, you know what? I want you, instead of saying auto for all of these, because this only gives the space that it needs, or only takes the space that it needs, I want one of these columns to take up the rest of the space. So I say star. And star will take up as much space as is available. If you have 2 rows that each have a height of star, they'll split the difference. So if you have, let's say, 60% of your form space available for those 2 rows, it's going to put 30% in each one. So now we have our rows defined. And if we look here, it's kind of hard to see. Let's put our cursor. We can't really see unless we are in the grid. It says right here 1 star. And that means that this right here, this whole space right now, is for the last row. Because everything else doesn't have anything in it, therefore it's collapsed down to nothing. So that's our row definitions. And now let's create just a couple of column definitions. So grid.column definitions. And we're going to have a column definition with not a height, but a width. We're going to say the same thing, auto. Like so. And now I'll have a couple of those. Let's do 3. And the last one being the auto width column. Now, if you want, what we could do is say, actually, we're only going to put things in the second column, and we're going to want it to be centered on the form. In which case, I would do this. Notice the line in the middle right now, because left and right are both taking up half the screen, because column 2, which is actually position 1, it's zero-based counting system, so 0, 1, 2. So the column at position 1 is taking up 0 space because it has nothing inside of it. But this would allow us to center this middle column. We could do the same thing with the rows if we wanted to, but I'm not sure we need to. So instead, what we can do is now we have our rows defined and our columns defined. Outside of this, in our grid, we can start adding things to our grid. Now you could drag and drop, but as you saw, drag and drop adds all that extra stuff that we don't really want. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to type it out by hand. And that may seem intimidating, but once you get used to the common controls, it's really simple to do. And if you're ever unsure about what a controls tag might be, you can open up the toolbox and grab what you want, let's just say a text block, and drag it onto the XAML designer, not the Windows or the form, not the WPF designer, but the XAML view, and just drop it on. And there you go. It's a text block. Okay? So I'm going to do this by hand. Now I want to put things in this first row, and I'm going to have it be in the second column. So I'm going to have, let's start with a text block first that says, let's go with just message. So it's going to be a message, and that's going to have the text box next to it. So let's start with something simple and just say text block. And we're going to say, you know what, I want this to be in grid.column. The column is column 1, and the grid.row is row 0. And I want this to say, I'm going to close it out and have values inside the text block, and it's just going to say message like so. Now if you notice right there, it now says message, and it's really tiny. Well, why is that? That's because we haven't changed the default font for our form. But never fear, unlike the WinForm project, we can change this font at any point because we can just say up here at the top, inside of Window, we can set our font. So font size equals, let's go with 18 and see what that looks like. Still a little small, so let's go with 22. That's a little better. So we now set the font for the entire form that's applied to everything, unless it's been specified already. So now we have the text block, which text block is the equivalent of a label in WinForm. So I want to put a text box next to it. And you'd say, well, we put the next column. But that means we have to put another column over here called auto. You don't want to be star. Let's not do that. We could put it underneath message, and that would work, but I really want to put it next to message. How would I do that? Well, there's these cool things I'm going to cut this out real quick. There's cool things inside of WPF called stack panels. And stack panels say, you know what? You can throw as many things as you want in here, and I will stack them either on top of each other or next to each other. And it depends on my orientation. So you say orientation is, in this case, horizontal. And then inside here, as many things as you want, you can stack. Now don't forget, we have to move the grid, column, and row out of text block and put it into stack panel. Because the stack panel is the thing that is in the column and the row. Okay, so message, and then we're going to have a text box. That's the thing that we actually put values into. We want to give it a name so we can reference it later. So x:\name. And the name is going to be message text. And then after that, we can just put slash and be done. But notice that that's a really small text box. I don't want to be that small, but I don't want to say this is your width. So what I can do is I can say min width, saying it in the minimum, I want this to be, 200 pixels wide. I can also set a max if I want to. So yes, you can grow, but not beyond this. So maybe max width is 400. And you can look at that by changing the min width and saying, yeah, that's probably too big. Maybe 300. That's probably big enough. And so we'll change the max width to 300 and the min width to 200. Now let's put a button below this. We can either put this on a new row or right in the stack panel. Let's put it right in the stack panel for now. Button, give it a name, and we're going to call this the add message. And let's just say add message. We go, whoops, I don't want it next to it. I want it to be below it. Or maybe I don't. Maybe I say, you know what? I kind of like it next to it, but no, I really want it to be below it. So let's cut this out and say we don't want it in this stack panel. Now we could nest another stack panel in this stack panel or one outside, but instead, I'm just going to paste this right here. And I'm going to, notice it puts it in the wrong spot. It puts it at 0, 0 for row and column. Instead, I want it to be at grid.row, and it's the row below my stack panel, so row 1, and grid.column to be column 1. And now it's right below my message. Notice it takes up the entire width because I haven't specified a width or a height for this button. So it took up the height of the text that's inside of it, and it took the width of the entire cell. So you can see how flexible this is, but at the same time, it does take a little bit more configuration or tweaking to get it quite right. The nice thing is the tweaking you have to do pretty much applies the same way to all the different items. So for instance, notice how, first of all, this is right up against the top of our window. Not a big fan of that. Let's move that down away from our bar up top. So I'm going to say margin. Now, margin is space on the outside of our item. So I want space on the outside of my stack panel. Padding is space on the inside. So if I wanted to have space in my stack panel before text block and text box, meaning padding inside of my item, I could put padding. But in this case, I want on the outside, and I want to say that the margin, first of all, it's left, top, right, bottom. So left is going to be 0. top, let's start with 10 and see what that looks like. Now, since I only did 2, it's saying left and right is 0, top and bottom is 10. And if we look at that, we can mouse over. That doesn't look too bad. But maybe I want to be a little bit higher than that. Maybe I want to be 20. That's better for the top, but not the bottom. So let's put 0, 10. And now we've specified all 4 margins. The left and right are 0. The top is going to be 20 pixels, and the bottom is 10 pixels. So that looks good, but now we have a problem where our text box is really close to our message text block. So we can either put a margin on our text block or on our text box. Let's put a margin on our text block. It really doesn't matter. Margin, 0 on the left, 0 up top, 5 on the right, and 0 on the bottom. And now if we look at it, it looks a little better. We have a little more space between the two. Now we can look at our button and say, that's great on left and right, but I really don't like the top and bottom. I wish there was more space between our text and the top of the button and the text and the bottom of the button. Well, that would be padding. It's the inside spacing. So I could say padding, left and right is 0, top and bottom, let's say 5, and now our button is a little bigger. And that looks a little more like what we're looking for. So these little tweaks here, these little styling tweaks, not that hard to do, and you can see visually what's happening and say, yep, I like that, or no, I don't really like that. The cool thing is, now with Hot Reload, what you can do is if you're running your application, and let's see if we can put this on a screen. So I'm going to run my application, and I am going to, let's see if I can't shrink this window down and pull this over here so you can see. Let's unpin this. And now if I said, man, I like this, but I really wish that, oh, I don't know, we had more space between message and my text box. Let's see what 15 would do. Notice I'm over here in my Visual Studio, and I type 1. Watch what happens to the space. It gets bigger. I can go, yeah, never mind. That's horrible. I put it back. That's perfect. Now, I can save these changes, and I can be doing this while it's running. So you can make changes to your XAML to have the layout exactly the way you want it while it's running. That's one of those features you'd see in your web design, and now you can do it in WPF as well. You can't change C# code, but you can change your XAML design on the fly live and then save it. And now you have those changes without having to go back and forth and make sure that the live preview is actually what you're looking at. So this preview right here, oops, it is pretty much exactly what you'll see when you run it, but maybe you have different states depending on the data coming in or something like that, and it just isn't quite as helpful. Well, you can run your application and then make live modifications to your XAML as needed to tweak the form to be exactly the way you want it to be. One other thing I didn't show you when I ran this, but let's run this again. I'm going to drag us over, and notice how much this is centered. This is centered exactly in my form. That's cool, but the user is probably going to say, I want this to be smaller. Check that out. It just continued to keep that centered no matter how big or small I made it. So it makes your form a little more responsive. Now you can make it a lot more responsive, but this is a good start. I could have made that top row to be a star as well and centered it vertically, but I decided not to do that. But at least this right here is already a step up from WinForms. The idea that your form can still look centered and look nice even when you change resolutions is pretty impressive. Now let's add a list box. So come back over here to our toolbox and look for a list box. There's one. We drag it on here and it's called list box. So pretty simple stuff here. So list box, we'll give it a name. And this name will be message list. And we need to give it a grid.row, and that should be row 2, because it's below messages. And then we need to have a grid.column of 1. And we should probably give it a margin. So let's give it a margin up top of, so nothing left and right, but the top should be, let's give it a full good margin, let's say 20. Like so. And now we have our list box, which of course is empty because there's nothing in it right now. Now this is where things get a little interesting. WPF is designed on the idea of data binding. And with WinForms, we had kind of data binding as an afterthought. So even the idea of taking a list and saying display this list was something that originally wasn't really in the cards for WinForms when it was first designed. With WPF, right out of the box, they say, you know what? We can bind to anything. And by binding, we mean take a code property and connect it to the front end in some way. Now, there is the idea in WPF of MVVM, and it's a front-end framework called Model View View Model. And the idea is a separation of concerns, and data binding is a really big part of that. We're not going to cover that in this course, but we are going to look a little bit at data binding, because this list box right here, we want to populate it with values from somewhere. Now, to follow our pattern, we're going to take the value from a binding list of string. But how do we put that in the list box? Well, putting a list box is just assigning it to the item's source, and we'll do that in code. But then how we display it? In our code inside of WinForms, we had to assign the display member. It's a little different in WPF because of the fact that WPF allows for flexibility. So in WPF, what we need to do is we need to have this idea of a data binding using a data template. So inside of list box, we're going to have an item called a list box dot item template. And the item template is the template for how do you lay out an item in this box. Inside there, we can say, well, this is a data template, meaning we're going to lay out data. And then I can place anything I want in here as far as XAML goes. I could have a grid. I could have a stack panel. I could have multiple values. So unlike WinForms, where I have one property that I can pull from, in here, I can pull from multiple properties, and I can even style them differently. So for this, since we only have a string, we really just need a text block. And that text block is going to have a binding on the text. And really it's just going to be binding. We're going to close that out, a self-closing tag. And so the text will be whatever value comes in from the item. Okay? So when we put a list associated with a list box, we take that list, it's going to say, well, for every item, create a text block and put the value in text, and that's it. Now, as we get objects, this become a little more complex as we put multiple text blocks and other things in here. Now, since there's only one item, I just put text block. If you had multiple items, you would need a grid or stack panels or something like that. With a text block, you cannot have multiple items inside data template. You have to use something that can then have multiple items inside of it. But since we have just one item to put in there, we can just put directly text block. Okay, now we have our form kind of set up. Is it hard to understand? Hopefully not, but it is different for sure than WinForms. But it is, hopefully, as you can see, much, much more powerful. So let's go to let's double click on our message, which if I click here, it takes me to my button. And I could double click and add that event, and that's the default click event, but I can also do this. First of all, I can go to the next line, that's no problem. And I can say, I want the click event. I hit tab, and it says, do you want to add a new event handler for the click event? I hit tab again, and it creates an add message underscore click event. And there we go. So there's the add message underscore click event handler. So it's handling that click event. And now I can do anything I want in here just like I could with Windows Forms. So when you click add, I want you to add this message, which is message text. I want you to add that to the list box. Well, right now we need a list first. So let's create a binding list, which control dot to add using system.component model. And the binding list is of type string. I want this to be messages equals new binding list of string. This looks very familiar to the code we wrote in the WinForms project. I'm not looking at that code, but pretty much we're following the same pattern. So it might be slightly different just because I'm not doing it note for note, but the reality is it's the same exact code. So we have our message list, which that's our list box. But instead of data source, it's items source. So that's the, again, slight tweak. And we say equals messages. Now you don't have to set up the display number. We've already done that. But now we're done. Now here, with our add message click, we can say messages.add and then take our string from message text.text and add to the list. And then say message text.text equals empty string. And that should be it. Let's see if this works the way we intend it to. Let's wait for it to load. Bring it over here and say this is a test. And it pops down here. This is another test of the messages. Notice how it's getting bigger, but then it stopped because that's the maximum width. Add that, and there we go. Now we have 2 items in our list, and this is back to the smaller width. So it's not taking up the rest of the space it could. It's taking up the minimum width of 200, even though it could take up to 300. But this is taking up more space because of the fact of this long message. So it has grown based upon the content that was in there. So with a slight modification, that being the item source here, the C# code itself is exactly the same for WPF. The difference is just how we build the user interface, and that's through this XAML code. Now, there's an awful lot of text on the screen in order to design that little form. And one of the complaints I've heard is, man, that's complicated compared to just drag and drop. And yes, that looks much more complicated. Now, it isn't compared to the hidden partial class that WinForms has. And it has a lot more power. Because these margins, they're flexible. Okay, so if, let's just say if we put this list box on top, it would move the other items down as it got bigger. So it's not going to overwrite it. It's going to move those items down now. Remember when I wrapped text before? So let's put the text wrap back on. text wrapping equals wrap. So if I do that on my text box, it's going to go to the next line. And let's just see what happens to the button. Remember, you overwrote there or hid that button last time. You throw a drag and drop. So if I'm just going to start typing, notice how it moves the button down. So I just keep moving this button down as much as I want because it's saying whatever space you take up is fine. The button goes below that. So those things right there make WPF a much, much more flexible and much, much more powerful language. Now, if you're using the very basics, like we're doing here, there is a bit more work. There's a lot more work, honestly, than WinForms. However, once you start getting into doing some of these more powerful things like the flexibility of automatic widths and things of that nature, you'll find that you can go a whole lot further than WinForms. At its heart, though, WPF is just a different user interface. The C# code behind it is the same. And so if you write your code well, you can transition from WinForms to WPF without much difficulty. You can keep your business logic, your data access code, all that you can keep. In fact, I did a course, and this is not a plug, this is just an example, but I did a course called C# application from start to finish. And the idea is we're going to build an entire application out of C#. And the base application is built with WinForms as its user interface. And some people are saying, man, I don't want a WinForm application, I want a WPF application. Or I want a ASP.NET MVC application. And so what I did is I created 2 add-on courses that replaced just the WinForm portion of the application with either WPF or ASP.NET MVC. And I didn't do hardly any coding work when it came to business logic or data access. In fact, almost none. I just did user interface code. This kind of code right here. We are clearing things out and moving the cursor or adding things to a list. Those type of user interface code, I did that code because that's directly tied to the user interface. But everything else was just call that code, call that code, call this code, and wire it back up the way it was. So if you do things right, your user interface does not have to be tightly tied to the rest of your C# code. So hopefully as you go through these different user interfaces, that's one of the things you take away from it is that you can decide what UI works for you, but don't get so tightly tied to it that your entire application has to be scrapped in order to go to a different user interface down the road. Okay, so that's WPF in a nutshell. There's an awful lot more depth here. We haven't covered MVVM. We haven't covered some of the more advanced types. And we haven't covered all the properties that you can have in these different XAML items. Just remember that first of all, we have covered the basics, and that by clicking on any of these, you can go to the properties window and look at what's available to you. So transforms and miscellaneous and all the rest. You can even look at the events as well. Now, secondly, notice that WPF is very, very similar to WinForms. So if you find something in WinForms you like, there's probably an equivalent in WPF. And sometimes the same is true the other way, but mostly it's not. So for example, there's not really a good equivalent of stack panel back in WinForms. WPF is the next logical progression in user interfaces. Okay, so play around with it, try it out, and let's look at what our pro tip for today is. And that is that WPF has nearly unlimited power to create amazing user interfaces. Just remember, it isn't your application. And this is something people often get confused. They say, I want to create a WPF application. And that gets confused with my entire application is WPF. Just your user interface is WPF. The actual application is C#. C# is what powers the logic of your application. Unless your entire application is just about pretty UI and not doing anything, then it's not your entire application. So don't focus so hard on a user interface that you forget that the primary thing to know and the primary thing to spend your time on is your C# application, the logic, the data access. These are the things that are what power your application. Your application will almost certainly be of no value if it has no data to put on a screen and if it has no idea what to do with the stuff that's on the screen. Okay? So don't focus so much on WPF that you lose track of the fact that you're actually building a C# application. And if you have to spend time somewhere, spend it on your logic rather than just making a pretty UI. Okay, your homework for today is very, very similar to the homework from the first WinForm lesson, and that's build a WPF application that has a simple data entry screen with first and last name fields. Have a button that says, hi, your first name, your last name. So hi, Tim Corey, when pressed. You can either do that in a pop-up window or you can even do that right on the screen. Try that out. Try the second one out. See if you can put it right on the screen somewhere and how that would work. Once you're done with that homework, come on back for the next lesson where we'll build a mini project with WPF.